Hello, everyone. It's Fred again from Notes of a Nomad, video number 340. Today, I want to talk about something that's sitting on my wrist. To most people, it's simply an old watch. But to me, it's much more than that. It's the Omega Seamaster 300 that I bought when I was 22 years old and living in South Africa 62 years ago. At that time, I paid approximately $120 for it. And that might not sound like a great deal of money, but at that time, the rent for a one room or bedroom apartment was about $35 a month. So this watch cost me more than 3 months' rent. And I did not simply walk into the shop and pay for it. I bought it on lay-by, which meant I paid for it gradually over a period of months. And only when I finally paid the full amount did I receive my watch. And when I finally put the watch on my wrist, I was enormously proud of it. At 22 years of age, it was probably one of the most expensive things I'd ever bought. And then I began wearing it. I wore it for many years, including the 15 years I worked underground in the gold mines in South Africa. I went down, it went down in some pretty challenging environments. It experienced dirt and dust and heat and hard work and undoubtedly got a few knocks along the way. But the watch survived. And of course, while I was surviving all those things, something else was happening. I was living my life. So this little watch was on my wrist during the years of work and adventure and change. It was there while I traveled and moved through different stages of my life. Over time, however, I misplaced the watch. And years went by, and then around 10 years ago, I found it again. You can imagine how delighted I was. But there was a problem. At some point, the watch had lost its bezel, the ring around the face of the watch. And I tried to find a replacement, but it wasn't easy. I looked in Canada. I contacted a watchmaker in United States. I even investigated possibilities while I was in Australia. And eventually, the Omega shop in Australia suggested the watch should be sent to Omega in Switzerland. So off it went to Switzerland. And I waited, and I waited, and I waited. And close to a year later, I finally got my watch back. It had been beautifully serviced at the cost of probably around 1,000 Australian dollars. But there was one problem. They've not been able to supply a replacement bezel, which was really the major reason I sent it to Switzerland. Now think about that. The manufacturer of this watch did not have replacement part I was looking for. So for the past few years, I continued looking for a bezel. And then earlier this year, I thought, why don't I ask ChatGPT? And one of the suggestions was to contact a European vintage watch chat room. And I did. And so earlier this year, someone suggested I might buy a similar vintage watch and use its bezel. So eventually I found a suitable watch from a German vintage watch dealer and I bought it. And that is the watch that's on this side of the page. That's the watch I bought earlier this year. And you'll see the black bezel around it. This was my watch that I had been to Switzerland without a bezel, no black bezel around there. But when the watch arrived, I didn't feel comfortable to remove the bezel. So I started wearing, this watch. And something happened. The moment I've had that familiar style of watch on my wrist again, memories began coming back. Memories of being 22, memories of South Africa, memories of working underground in the gold mines. And that's when I began to realize it was never really just about telling time. A few months later, something extraordinary happened. I was contacted by a vintage watchmaker who saw that chat room and asked whether I was still looking for a bezel because he had several. Now, knowing these bezels were extremely rare, I ultimately decided to buy one, and it arrived just over a week ago. And the collector kindly helped me during an online meeting to place the bezel on my original watch, which is this one, and it's now on my wrist. And I have my original watch back, the watch I bought when I was 22 years old, the watch I misplaced and found again, the watch that went all the way to Switzerland, the watch whose missing bezel I searched for many years. And now I have to admit something. I traditionally live frugally. So when I calculate the amount of money I've spent buying the second vintage watch and eventually acquiring the rare replacement bezel, I spent quite a few $1,000s. And it's a considerable amount of money for me. And yes, I could ask myself, was that sensible? Perhaps a younger version of me would have said, that's ridiculous. But I'm now 84 years old, and I've thought about it. Am I happy that I did it? Very. Why? Because when I look down at my wrist now, and I do not just see an expensive old watch, I see my life. I see the 22-year-old young man who carefully paid for the watch month by month. I see the gold mines. I see South Africa. I see decades of work, challenges, and experiences. The watch has no magical powers. It cannot bring back the past, but somehow it can open a door to it. And perhaps that's the message I want to share with you today. Throughout our lives, we accumulate things, but occasionally something becomes connected with who we are and where we have been. It might be an old photograph or piece of jewelry or a book or a letter or a piece of furniture, but perhaps, as in my case, an old watch. The important question is not always, what is it worth? Perhaps we should ask, what does it mean to me? And there's also another lesson I learned. For much of my life, I've been very careful with money. I think that's served me well. But if we spend our lives saving, working, and being responsible, there may become a time when we need to give ourselves permission to enjoy something that genuinely brings us happiness. Not because we want to impress someone, not because it's fashionable, but because it's meaningful. At 84, I know I have less time ahead of me than behind me. And that's not a sad statement, it's simply a fact of life. So perhaps I am more aware that if something can bring genuine pleasure into my remaining years, I should not automatically say no simply because it costs money. I'm glad I found the bezel. I'm glad I restored my original watch. And I'm glad after all these years, I can once again look down at my watch and see it there. So perhaps my message for this 340th Notes of a Nomad is this. Don't be too quick to dismiss nostalgia. The past is gone, but our memories are still part of us. Sometimes an old object can remind us not only of where we have been, but who we were, and perhaps how much we have lived. And occasionally, something that appears to be expensive may be priceless for a completely different reason. Because some things are not simply object, they are chapters of our lives. And sometimes it's worth bringing one of those chapters back. So thanks for joining me on Notes of a Nomad, number 340. And now, if you excuse me, I think I'll have another look at the time. So with that, wish you, your family, and friends lots of love and laughter. Bye for now. Until next time, from Fred and Notes of a Nomad.